Thank you so much for joining us. We welcome you. We're happy to have you. We're excited to host Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick-Gray, our UUA president. I've been putting in the chat that you should put your name and your state, your congregation, a land acknowledgement, pronouns. I'm going to ask you to add to that list of things that UUs do, the social justice issue that motivates you to act. I'm going to ask you to be mindful of your mic, place yourself on mute. We don't want to have to do that for you. And we do want to minimize the interruptions and respect the conversation that we're going to try and have. This event is being recorded, so please feel free to be on or off camera as you attend to your own particular comfort or whatever might be going on in your household. I love to see your faces, but we understand that some of us need moments away from the screen. Please be respectful of each other in the chat, respectful of our speakers and our hosts. We're doing our best to have a good event for you this evening. So my name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the Executive Director of Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. One of your hosts this evening. I use he, him, and L pronouns. I'm a bald guy with a goatee wearing a shirt and a tie. I'm set against a virtual background that displays our logo and the Capitol Dome. I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., living on Anacostan ancestral lands. And I join you tonight from my home in the middle of bedtime for my 7-year-old. So I thank my wife for holding down that part of life this evening. And I beg your forgiveness if my 7-year-old jumps on my lap during our evening. I want to acknowledge that we have Paulette of UUSJ managing the technology, who is always great. We will do our best to keep things moving along and smoothly. And we are pleased to have Reverend Susan converse with us this evening. As Unitarian Universalists, we are constantly seeking to engage our assumptions and challenge our own understanding of what is possible, what is important. And so we will hear from Reverend Susan this evening about what our faith teaches and promises with an eye towards the federal frame and what that implies about our collaboration. We're also blessed to have several folks helping me host this evening. We have Reverend Joan Javier Duval of the Unitarian Church of Montpelier, Vermont, and part of UUA's Poor People's Campaign Leadership Council. We have the Reverend Aaron Walter, Executive Director of Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry and a member of the Texas Poor People's Campaign. And we have the seminarian Malia Hausnett, founder and owner of Emergence Consulting and a UUSJ trustee. And they will all be helping me as I try to MC this evening. So to do that well, we're gonna try and keep things going at a clip. We're gonna open a sacred space and light the chalice. We thank Reverend Joan for that. Then Reverend Dr. Susan will share a reflection. Afterwards, Reverend Aaron, Malia, and I will manage some Q&A with Reverend Susan. After that, Reverend Joan will extinguish our chalice and our event will reach its soft close. But I've heard repeatedly from you guys that you love our warm and lingering goodbyes and having me answer the odd question in the style of an after-service coffee hour, so we will do that. Finally, I want to give special thanks to all of you who were able to contribute towards our match opportunity with your tickets and your extra donations. I'm pleased to announce we exceeded our event goal by 25%, which means we have unlocked the first portion of funds available to us. Thanks to your generosity, we're closer to our fiscal year event goals, and we are hopeful we will make that with your continued support. If you want to make a donation to nudge our figures up, It's not too late. We will drop a link in the chat. We believe that UUs have a critical voice in federal matters, and we are building a UU movement for federal advocacy. We believe that UUs can collaborate across state and federal lines, and we are building a culture for that purpose. And so, to borrow a phrase from the Black church or from civil rights movement history, this is UUSJ's brick a day moment. It's up to us to build an effective and unremitting UU presence for federal engagement. And we can only do that together. We can only do that if we all bring bricks to this sacred work to get the job done. So again, we welcome you. We're happy to have you. We're excited to host Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick-Gray, our UUA president. Please add your particulars to the chat. Be mindful of the mic. This event is being recorded, and please be respectful of each other, our UUA president, the hosts. And with that, I give you Reverend Joan Javier Duval. Paulette, please spotlight Reverend Joan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to follow Pablo's lead and provide you a visual description of myself for accessibility. I'm a 40-ish-year-old woman with dark hair. I'm wearing a gray blazer, and I have a blue chalice in the foreground. As we begin our time together, I invite you to take a breath and to take a moment to call to heart and mind your reason for being here this evening. Those people, those communities that inspire you to put love into action. And I invite you to join me in the spirit of prayer. In these shaky and unsteady times, we turn to you, O source of strength, spirit of compassion, for we need fortitude in these times of uncertainty, to hold on, to see clearly, to reach out in love. We hold in heart and mind all of us who feel the pain of poverty in this moment, all of us who feel the pain of violence in this moment, all of us who desire what we know we all deserve, the chance to live with safety, health, and dignity, and to know the flourishing of life. May we find guidance within ourselves and beyond ourselves. May we be restless for truth when truth is cast aside. May we be seekers of peace as the pounding of violence grows louder around us. And in all of this, may love rule our hearts. May we know the source of love within us and stay grounded in that source as we lament and turn our mourning into organizing. May we be that unsettling force that will move a moral agenda forward and work towards creating a more just, peaceful, and sustainable present and future together. And I invite you to join in lighting a chalice if you have one nearby. Let us kindle these flames of courage and hope to light our way.
Thank you, Reverend Joan. That was beautiful. So with that, I'm going to begin to give our formal introduction, which I think most of us know who the Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick-Gray is, but on the off chance that you're not aware, she is our UUA president and has beautiful story arc to her journey from Arizona to Boston, from organizing to leading. In many ways, she's been our president, a pandemic president, pastoral president, leading us all through this pandemic. And in so many ways, she is the president that we needed at this moment. And we were sent her ministry to guide us through this difficult time. So I'm pleased to have her speaking with us this evening. And with that, I give you our UUA president, Susan Frederick-Gray.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I'm honored to be here. I don't know if it's spotlighting me yet or not, if I should.
Yeah.
There we go. There we go. Good evening, late afternoon, depending on where you are. Good day to everyone. It's so good to be here. Thank you, Pablo, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Reverend Joan, for the beautiful prayer and starting us off in that spirit of prayer. I'm honored to be with you all. I'm excited to see folks from all over the country here. And before I was in Arizona, I was doing organizing and ministry in Ohio, and I see a number of people here from Ohio and the justice organizing team in Ohio, including Reverend Joan. So it's lovely to be here and to see old friends and to meet new ones this evening. I'm honored to be here, and I'm excited to reflect with you all about the importance of federal advocacy. I just want you to know how grateful I am for the ministry of UUSJ. And those of you who've been with UUSJ a number of years might remember that really early on in my presidency, I had the opportunity to, I would say, crash a board meeting maybe at one of our congregations in Bethesda and Cedar Lane when the board of UUSJ was meeting. And that was it feels so long ago. And yet it was only, it was less than 6 years ago, I think, when I got to stop in and have some time at that board meeting. So this feels really full circle in a way in terms of my own presidency, as I'm in my last 6 months, and that was probably within my first 6 months. So it's good to be with you all. And it's been wonderful to work with UUSJ in different ways throughout my time as president. And during Joan's prayer, I was thinking of moments that have held me and why I'm here. And I was remembering times when we've been on the ground in DC and I've been able to join with you all, or we've partnered with UUSJ and the UUA for Poor People's Campaign events. And those have been incredibly powerful in the fight for democracy, in the fight for a moral agenda, the fight for programs and federal policies that lift people up. And so it's just been wonderful to partner with you in those memories, and future opportunities that I know will be ahead as well are deeply important to me. Pablo asked me about, the importance of federal policy when it comes to our UU values and our justice commitments. And as I thought about that question, I mean, there's so many reasons to be engaged in federal policy. In the midst of the pandemic, it mattered that we had COVID relief at a federal level, that helped Americans and communities across the country. And one of the things that came just highest to mind was the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And, in the absence of federal legislation, to protect rights, they are so easily overturned. And that became so clear last June when Roe was overturned. And as we fight for democracy, and I noticed a lot of people put in the chat democracy, and that's one of my core issues. I think it's absolutely connected to our core values as UUs. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We know that every voice matters and is needed, and that the ability to vote, the right to vote, access to the vote is a recognition in our wider society that an individual's voice is needed. and taking away that right to vote, which we see so many places, and which we've seen in the ways the court has dismantled the critically important Voting Rights Act, that again, federal legislation that helped change and actually, for the first time, really allow the United States to say it was truly a democracy. So I appreciate when people recognize that our democracy is only 50 years old, and it's all, we're not even living into that democracy today. We know all the ways that through gerrymander and voter suppression that has been rolled back, but it really was the Voting Rights Act was, when finally more Americans, most Americans finally were able to vote. So that was federal legislation. And that was, that came about because of federal advocacy and statewide action and local organizing and the combination of movement building across states and pressure on the federal government. So I just, I want to lift up what it means, as Pablo said, to partner across states in our UU movement and to partner with other grassroots movements in trying to push bold change. And when we can get change at the federal level, it makes the biggest impact for the most people. And that is critically important. So I just wanted to start off and share those thoughts on the importance of the work of UUSJ, the importance of partnership with UUSJ, not just for people in the DMV area, but for all of us. And I'm grateful for the ways that our statewide action networks are here. And that we, I think, have been working intentionally to build stronger connections between statewide advocacy networks, UUSJ, and the UUA. And I know that there's more to be done, and I'm proud of the work that we've done in the ways that specifically UU the Vote has helped us unlock a lot of relationships. So I'm honored to be here. I'm grateful to see all of you. And like I said, both old friends and people I'm meeting for the first time tonight. It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Susan. So now, Paulette, can you spotlight the folks that will help us ask some questions? And when we put this event together, I started asking folks, well, what, gee whiz, we finally got Reverend Susan Frederick-Gray to speak with us. Like, what do we want to ask her? I was, so excited. And I shared my excitement with many folks within UUSJ and elsewhere. And I started to gather thoughts and ideas of questions, and so many things came at me. It was like a fire hose of good ideas. But we've done our best to sort of focus the questions on the big ticket items that UUs are thinking about and grappling with. And for the purpose of asking some of those questions, we have, again, Malia, Reverend Aaron, and Reverend Joan. And Reverend Joan joining us. So here we go. I'm going to invite Reverend Aaron to ask the first question.
Thank you, Pablo, and Reverend Susan. Thank you so much for your reflection. I want to bring greetings from our siblings in the coalition of UU state action networks, and thank our siblings at UUSJ for the invitation. And also, following your lead, I'll introduce myself visually, and then I'll ask my question. So I'm a fair-skinned woman in my 40s with reddish hair and a butterfly poncho. And I've got a background behind me of the Poor People's Campaign March in DC from last year, where I got to see some of you folks marching, and the Texas UU Justice Ministry logo. So that's what I've got going on in my Hollywood Square tonight. And so my question for you, Reverend Susan, thank you for taking the time with us. This was something that was on the hearts and minds of the Texas UU Justice Ministry folks when we had our 10th anniversary gathering a couple of weeks ago. We were really talking about this. So taking into account the universalist dimension of our faith, how and when should we engage with elected officials and staff with whom we strongly disagree? How do you decide when to leverage the prophetic voice for social justice work in federal or all matters? And of course, as you can imagine, here in Texas, this is a very real, practical question, not just a theological one, and I welcome your thoughts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I forgot to introduce myself visually, and I really appreciate that. So I'm not going to forget the question, but I would love to do that. And so I'm a mid-40s white woman with brown hair that has highlights of gray and red-rimmed plastic glasses and a wine-colored jacket. And there is a beautiful quilt behind me that UU in Youngstown, Ohio made for me many, many years ago at my first settlement. So it brings me joy. It's a rainbow colored stitched together quilt. So from our universalist theology, how should we engage, and should we engage with people who we deeply disagree with? Well, I think the answer is yes, absolutely. And it is important to be strategic and to understand if and how we can engage in ways that might have an impact. So I want to tell a story. That's okay. I do tend to tell stories. So when I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and the minister of the UU congregation of Phoenix, we were combating a piece of legislation in the state house that was just in committee at this point. And it was part of UU Jazz, which is the state action network in Arizona. So we had our legislative day. We had, 100 UUs down at the state capitol. And it was a bill that would have created an armed volunteer militia to enforce immigration law. Now, that is just incredibly dangerous. And I don't even know what all the words are for that, but just negligent and horrible. And so we met with one of the Republicans who was on the committee. I think he was the chair of the committee. I think it was Kavanaugh was his last name. I'm not thinking of his first name. And we met with him about this bill, and he was former law enforcement. And we were able to talk to him about how dangerous it was to arm people who would feel especially called to do this in a volunteer role, with almost no training, how we would be arming the most, potentially dangerous people. And I felt like we actually got through to him. I don't know. But I remember seeing in his eyes and there had recently been a shooting of someone who was a vigilante in a community. So it was like, this is people will die because of this. This is, absolutely dangerous and wrong. And it never got out of committee. He was the chair of the committee. But I feel like he heard us. I feel like he heard, as a previous law enforcement officer, as a person and a human being, how dangerous that kind of policy and legislation would be. Now, I've had plenty of conversations with people I disagreed with who I don't think listened at all, who barely even let us speak sometimes. So I also think it is important to understand the landscape, to know who you can talk to, who will listen, and how you build relationship in those ways so that they may be able to influence the people who will never listen to you. Or there may be something because about their story, the importance of building relationship with legislators who are human beings, parents, grandparents, children, they're human beings. When you build relationship with them, there are sometimes things that can be shifted. So I think we absolutely should. And it's also, it's also important to save our energy for the ways we think, because sometimes a conversation can affect some people and just building power will affect other people. Right? You just have to have the votes. You just have to be able to do something that impacts their ability to do their job. And that's about building power. So there's always, I think, multiple pathways to work, and making those kinds of calculations is important.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question is mine. And this is a big one for those of us at USJ. So the question I want to proffer is, so what does Unitarian Universalism have to say or teach about navigating the very tensions that arise between the goals stated by marginalized, oppressed, or impacted communities that we're trying to be accountable to, and the decision of whether or not to support legislation or policies that are arising from the political compromises at play? That's a very real tension in our work. I'm wondering your thoughts.
Absolutely. So that is a huge tension, and I've been in that tension many times. So you asked what Unitarian Universalism has to say to that, and I think there's a couple things, and I do honestly think so many things depend on other things. So I don't think there's one right answer to this question or the previous question. But one thing that I think is really important about Unitarian Universalism is that we do care about relationship. We believe in the community of humanity, right? We care about our neighbors, we care about our communities, our understanding of faith, which can mean a lot of things, but is not always about a relationship with something external to life, but actually right here. So I think the importance and centrality of relationship and community really matters in Unitarian Universalism. I think it's what helps us be bridge builders. And so this goes to your question, and kind of what our role is and how we operate in these spaces and what we can bring to it. So I think sometimes we can help build bridges. I think sometimes we can try to operate in multiple spheres at the same time. Maybe not exactly the same people, some of you might be over here and others might be over here, but as long as we're staying in relationship and community, we can work hard to try to navigate the hard decisions that we have to make about policy, and the trade-offs that have to be made. But the foundation of relationship, I think, is really important. And so again, another story, if you will. This was really live in Arizona. I don't want to go all the way to always to Arizona, but that was so much experience of mine, where, if you remember, I think it was 2016 or 2015. No, it wasn't it was like 2014 or 2015. John Boehner was the Speaker of the House, and people were pushing for an immigration reform bill that was going to double down on militarization of the border, which was a huge issue in Arizona because of the over-policing already of the border and ICE and Border Patrol and all those things. But that was the trade-off that was being considered in DC. And it was complicated on the ground because we had multiple folks in grassroots movements, right? In Latinx-led organizations that were were unsure about whether or not to get behind this bill because of the border enforcement. And not everyone chose the same path. But what I saw happen that taught me something powerful was the organizers did not go after each other. The organizers on the different sides did not go after each other. And at one point, they really did come together. John McCain was a part of this. They really did come together and try to push for it a little bit, like those who were like, we just need to end this criminalization and stop the deportations, and this is not a good bill. They didn't push hard on it, but they showed up to a couple press conferences to be in relationship. So that was powerful, to not be fractured over these issues, even as they were very much in disagreement and they were really hard choices to make. So I think our capacity to see nuance is important as Unitarian Universalists, and to be in relationship, because I think that helped. we had a relationship with a group that was strongest, and we, as UUs in my UU church, were in solidarity with that group. And so I think that's another piece, but again, not fighting each other over it. So I think that's important. I think sometimes, if something, and that never passed, right? So it didn't get through. But when there are things that get through, staying connected to grassroots or more radical, if that's the right term, we could use a lot of terms, groups is important, because sometimes small changes can be made in those bills that make a big difference. And sometimes bills get passed that end up doing a lot of harm. And so even though on the surface, it seems like they'll do good, so it's important to stay connected and listening to grassroots directly impacted communities, because there may be bills that really aren't worth pushing, because sometimes that closes down the federal conversation. We did that. We addressed that. So these are all calculations that, the people who are deeply in the work often have to make, but relationship and bridge building as a foundation of that work, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
Did I muddy the waters?
I don't know, we're going to keep going on that, some of that same theme, but I'll introduce myself as well. Malia Hausnecht, she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the UUSJ Board of Trustees and a UU seminarian coming from right now very cold Minnesota. And I am also a femme person in my early 40s with just over shoulder length brown hair, and some shaded windows behind me, as well as a small shelf of books that is increasingly addressing theology. So thank you so much for being here with us. And I want to keep talking about this idea of accountability. It's something that UUSJ is wrestling with, along with, I think, our movement more broadly. And so I would love it if you could talk a little bit about what your experience of being present in Charlottesville in particular taught you about why intersectional justice work is so important, and what you think we as UUs need to be doing so that we're really in accountable relationship to communities experiencing intersectional oppression. What does accountability look and feel like for us?
Right. I mean, again, I think relationship really matters. And when you're in relationship with an organization, and relationship is a human thing. So when you, as people in a UU organization, are in relationship with leaders in other organizations, doing our best to show up when we are asked, providing what we are asked for, is like, that's key to accountability. And it's faithfulness. It's showing up again and again. It's asking what would be helpful, not assuming what would be helpful or coming in with all the answers. There are sometimes, times when an individual can't show up, or an organization can't show up for a particular reason, right? And those, like, being faithful and showing up whenever you can helps guide the relationship through the times when you can't. And those things happen for various reasons. So I think it means, being thoughtful in what we push for, that we're in communication with those groups and they know what we're doing. If we're operating as UUSJ or one of our statewide organizations, and we're moving something where we haven't talked to our partners, to directly impacted communities, and said, we're gonna want to push something, what do you think about this? Then we are not being accountable. We have to build, when we are pushing things, it can't just come from I say us, but I look at that because UUs, our faith tradition, even a lot of religious traditions have a great deal of privilege, right? So it's important that whatever we're pushing for, we are in conversation, and that is informed by directly impacted communities. I think in Charlottesville, some of what I learned was just, it wasn't just Charlottesville, but it was other opportunities too. But, my experience in Charlottesville just reinforce the ways in which, and this is just the ways in which policing in this country is devastating communities and is deeply racist. You know, what happened in Charlottesville was that the police we couldn't even see them. They themselves were back behind barriers while armed white supremacists were marching down the street. Faith leaders were witnessing for love, counter protesters were there, and the police were nowhere. And that's not what happens when there are protests in the streets in Ferguson or in Phoenix or in Minneapolis, right? That's not what we see when Black communities are coming out to protest because, again, another life has been taken by the police. And so I guess in one of the ways it shows intersectionality is it shows the way policing in this country undermines public safety. It intersects with poverty. It intersects with racism. It undermines democracy as people lose their rights to vote through the way we criminalize people because they are poor, because they are Black or brown. So, but that was one of the most important lessons I learned about it. Learned again in Charlottesville. We can talk more about accountability, but Charlottesville takes me down different kinds of pathways. It was.
You're going down the pathways that we're talking about in our communities too, Susan. And so I really appreciate it. As a friend of mine was saying, here in Texas, where many of us are without power still, the kids have not been in school for 4 days. When we talk about whether or not we have the funds or the will to feed and house people or fix our grid, she said, look at the police budget. Get the money there. And so thank you for what you're talking about. The next question that I have on the docket for you is, how can you best coordinate social justice education and advocacy between the state and national levels? And I imagine even the local congregational levels, but how can we best coordinate at these different levels? And what is the role of the UUA in achieving that outcome?
Yeah, great question. And boy, is it hard, right? I wish it weren't. It feels like it should be easy, and it's not, because we all have been trying to do it in different ways and being successful sometimes and not as much as we want. So, one of the things that's a challenge for it is that a local community, well, first of all, is that we're all working on shoestring budgets. And I mean, I recognize the UUA has the biggest footprint in the landscape, and still it's not all the resources we need, or could use. And we're always making trade-offs, and all of our organizations are also doing that in much more significant ways. So I do just recognize that, keep, doing the work of our individual organizations takes so much capacity. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is that we can be really focused in issue. One of the things that partnership takes is an alignment around issues, and that we don't always have that. It was great when we had that around democracy, and I think the UUA was well positioned to say, hey, let's all try to work on this. And then we could work together and help fund and, do different things in partnership because we were working on one issue. I think that has happened at other times. I mean, I remember, I think over a period of about 8 or 10 years, the UUA was able to do a lot of work around immigration and statewide advocacy networks did it. UUSJ was working on it federally. Lots of states were working on it. So there was momentum around a common issue, and that helped us both educate our people more broadly and actually move some changes. DACA being one of them, but also local changes, various kinds of things. So I think that when we can align on an issue or two, that is the most helpful. And we don't always have that kind of alignment, and we can't always force that alignment, right? There can be really critical issues going on in particular states that are just not happening in other states, and feel, a water issue, right? policing issue, immigration issue, homelessness, right? I mean, there are ways in which state advocacy networks need to be focused on those issues that are most impacting their state. But when we have alignment, I think that's when we can have the most impact at the widest scale. And what's the UUA's role? That's a good question. I think that, I think when there is alignment, we can help, or when there's beginning to see some commonality, we can begin to spotlight that and help create more buy-in and more support across the movement for that work. We sometimes can raise money and help resource it locally. I know we wish we could do more and need to do more and all those things, but I just think that's another place where I think the UUA can play a role. And we can convene things. We're not the only ones. You all are convening, UUSJ are convening this great event, bringing together, UUA and statewide leaders and UUSJ leaders. So we're not the only ones, but I think we can show up, sometimes convene things, provide resources, host conversations, things like that. But it's that alignment piece that really, I think we can start to move in incredible ways. And it's hard when there's so many issues, right? It's hard, it's hard. It
is.
We're trying to gear up around reproductive justice, right? And feel a little bit behind on it. And then we'll wait, but we still need all this capacity around these other issues too. So it's hard.
Absolutely. And, speaking of reproductive justice, our next question for you is sort of leaning in the direction of how do we manage some of those cleavages. So what does our faith teach about how we go about criticizing potential allies? If we see that the actions they propose are less effective in pursuit of justice than we or the impacted communities are hoping or suggesting or clamoring for.
Right. Again, it can depend. If you have relationship, I think the first thing is privately. That may be a group of people going to someone's office, right? But it's not a public call out. If you have relationship, leaning into that relationship first, I think is important for maintaining that relationship, and trying to try to shift the person from where they are, or at least let them know what the consequences of what they're moving are. Like, even if you can't shift them, you want to make sure they understand what the impacts are. So I think when there's that kind of relationship, and I know you all build relationship with legislators, so talking to them, calling them, getting a meeting, reaching out personally, I think is most important first. And I say that because, I'm in a very public place too, right? And actually, more people I know are running for office and getting elected. And it's hard when you get in there and you're faced with the trade-offs that are often nothing what you want, and maybe not even what you thought before you were in that role. And it's hard to, it's hard to be in those situations. So education is important, especially if it's a matter of they don't understand, and leveraging the personal relationship. And when that isn't enough and it really needs to be stopped, how do you work with the people who are trying to stop it? You may not, sometimes you do have to do a public call out. I mean, absolutely. Sometimes that happens. And, but, I think, and is needed. Sometimes it is what is absolutely needed, but it's always a kind of calculation of, is there a better path? Can you get them to change? And is there a better path to do that? And if not, then naming what the consequences of their decisions are, or of their position. And that's We see that in the Biden administration. We certainly saw it in the Obama administration with immigration, right? I mean, it was incredibly disappointing. And even the whole ethos that increasing deportation and militarization would get us immigration reform, which it didn't. And it, orphaned hundreds of thousands of children whose parents were taken from them. Millions of people deported, hundreds of thousands of children had the government take their parents away. Like, that's devastating. So yes, sometimes you just have to name it and push back and put pressure on them to change. Sometimes very strong public pressure too, through marches and protests and things like that. Kirsten, I know I just know so much about Arizona, but Kirsten Sinema, right? There's one trying to get her to do something differently. Wasn't effective, but.
So this probably builds well on that then. We've been talking about the importance of working on legislation as one critical means to change systems. But I want to, certainly it's not the only kind of change work that's critical. And there are things that are complementary for creating those just systems, institutions, and structures. And in particular, I think many of us have been very excited by the increased focus right now on the importance of storytelling and narrative change. And so I'm hoping you can speak to, how does narrative change work as a complement to the policy, education, and advocacy? How do those pieces work together?
Yeah. Okay. I want to write something that I want to say later. I'll get to the narrative change, but I don't want to forget this. Okay. Narrative change. I mean, so I don't know how many of you were in were at the WARE lecture last year with Ibram X. Kendi. It was beautiful. It was powerful. And I'm sorry you can't watch it. He would not let us continue to have that online. So he had to be there. But he talked about the ways in which narratives often get created to support or when the moral when things change. And so let's say, you have a moral change around same-sex marriage, right? People's views begin to shift. Then the narrative on the right will actually shift to try to create a different frame. So, I mean, I don't know if he would say, I'm not speaking for him, but I think about the ways that early anti-LGBT same-sex marriage policy was about, it's going to ruin marriage in general. Now we've got this whole grooming thing, right? I mean, it's just like now the children are at risk. First marriage was at risk, now children are at risk. So the ways in which, and he talked about that in terms of his public view on slavery began to shift and the ways narrative shifted. So narrative is very effective. And storytelling is very important. And I think that we do see in our movements like the LGBT movement, how important personal storytelling was to changing people's hearts and minds and then their votes, right? I think that it has been incredibly powerful in the immigrant rights movement, right? And was a huge part of moving DACA forward, getting DACA. And I think it can be and is beginning to be very important in the reproductive justice movement as well, as people understand that abortion is healthcare, right? And that women die when they don't have access, can die when they don't have access to safe and effective abortion. But I also think narrative is tricky. And so I just, I want to complicate it, because if narrative, and this goes back to your previous question about accountability, if we're not really understanding how our stories, the implications of our stories and our narrative frame, how that is the impacts of that in a directly impacted community, we will fail to achieve the kind of liberation or even push for the things we need. And again, reproductive justice, reproductive healthcare is a great example of that. And I don't know all the answers because I'm not as plugged in as I could be, but just talking about a right, protecting the right to abortion is not actually what reproductive justice looks like, right? Given the awful disparity in maternal health rates and maternal death for Black women in this country, like given that folks don't even have access to the prenatal care they need to have a healthy baby, given poverty and the ways in which, families and single people are raising children in poverty and there aren't resources to support them or their children, like all of those are reproductive justice issues. Abortion is just one piece of it. But when we just focus the narrative on abortion, you could make a kind of win that ends up benefiting a subset of the population that may already have access to what they need because of their privilege and resources, right? So same thing with DACA happened. Like a lot of the narrative was these kids came here with no fault of their own, which implied that their parents did something wrong, right? It ended up buying into a frame of good immigrants and bad immigrants. So I just like narrative is so important and it has to be accountably held. And it doesn't mean we won't make mistakes, but we have to learn when our partners tell us you are actually reinforcing this narrative. We have to listen and we have to broaden our narratives so that we really are fighting for liberation and justice for everyone, for the broadest group possible. And so that just goes back to accountability. The narrative is critically important to changing hearts and minds, but it can also leave things behind that just create the same disparity again and again and again. Yeah, and let me go back to this. Something occurred to me about the partnership between statewide and UUSJ. And I just, I really hope to see greater partnership continue to grow in these relationships because, for the statewide advocacy networks, you've got these senators and these Congress people in DC, and you've got these UU partners in DC. And how do you partner together to help put pressure that isn't just coming from folks in DC? And, I just think that that's, an opportunity through partnership and working together. And then the other thing is with accountability and our partners is, and I'm sure you all do this, but like being able to help grassroots partners get in the rooms with leaders who would never meet with them. We certainly did that. I know UUSC does that at the UN, gives their, helps create meetings that then Indigenous partners can come to, right? And actually be the ones to speak to the people, to the legislator or the UN leader, whoever in DC, because they won't meet with people, right? So that's a very handy accountability piece for a group with power and privilege that can often get in the door.
Yeah. I'll just add a little story here around that, and then Reverend Aaron gets the last question. Our immigration action team had a lovely meeting with a senator from Louisiana, and we invited some on-the-ground folks from an immigrant organization there, and mostly Africans now living in New Orleans area. And after the meeting, the meeting was the meeting, right? It was what it was. But the most important thing from the meeting was actually after the meeting, when those folks said to us, UUSJ, Pablo, we've tried to talk with these folks so many times. We meet with these legislators at the state level or in the city, and they just ignore us. And really, you in the room with us, this was the first time that we felt like our stories were taken seriously and they heard us.
Yeah.
So, we at UUSJ have lived the example that you just gave. Yeah. Reverend Aaron, the honor and privilege of the last question is yours.
Thank you. And I will say how much we in Texas have enjoyed the teamwork with UUSJ, getting to speak with our senators, as well as the last time I was here for a big UUSJ event, I was here with Representative Donna Howard, one of our state representatives who's a Unitarian Universalist, which brings me to our final question. Reverend Susan, you have experience running for an office. We know that we would like to see UU values and even more to the point, the experiences of directly impacted people that we are in relationship with in those halls of power. So what encouragement or what advice would you give to folks around running for offices? Let's fire people up.
Let's do it.
How do we support our directly impacted folks, and how do we get our folks running for office?
Right. I mean, I think, well, support your people when they run. It is important for a lot of folks, especially I think the people we really want in office, they won't put themselves forward, right? So I'm thinking of a friend who ran for city council, and I was one of the people whispering to him, I think you could run for office, and like saying that to people that you think would be good at it is important. It sows a seed. It's not something, I mean, I ran for this job because some people said to me, I think you could be good at that, right? And that it's not like I hadn't ever, I mean, it was actually, I thought of it first because people told me, right? And when other people told me, it encouraged me. So I think when you see that kind of leadership in someone, members of your congregation, people in the community, whether they're from like your grassroots partners, that's one of the people who ran for office, right? Who I was like, you should run for office. And so like identifying leaders and telling them you see that leadership in them, that is huge. And especially women, people of color, we don't always put ourselves forward without that kind of, I see it in you, right? And those are the people we want to run, not the people who just think they have it in them and deserve the job, right? So I think that's one thing. I think, being willing to help them, raise money for them, be on their committees, knock doors. I think the vote was critical to help us learn how to make phone calls and knock doors, right? Like that's, if you did that, you can run for office, you can go out and knock your own doors, and you can build a team. So I think that's, I think it's about encouraging each other when you see it in someone, and then being willing to help them. Like not just saying you should do it, but I'll help you, because no one does it alone, right? Those committees and teams are so important. And, I acknowledge that it's a huge sacrifice, and start local, right? School board, we got running for school board in places like, try it, do one, run for anything. I think that's what Stacey Abrams says, right? Run for anything. Like if you feel it in your heart and other people see it in you, go for it. Think about where you can make a difference. We used to have a lot more UUs in government positions, and I think we are needed, and good people, directly impacted community leaders are needed as well.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Again, this has been a great panel, great answers to hopefully interesting and stimulating questions. I think from the chat that we achieved that. And so now I invite Reverend Joan back to extinguish the chalice, and then I will close this out.
Yes, wow, what a powerful conversation. Let's just take a breath and touch in for our gratitude for this time that we've shared, for all that we've learned, all that we've wrestled with openness and integrity. May we move forward together as Unitarian Universalists seeking social justice, committed to lifting our voices with courage. May we partner in relationships of mutuality across divisions of religion, race, class, and geography, in the faithful practice of putting love into action. We extinguish our chalice flames and carry with us the fire of commitment into the days ahead.
Thank you so much, Reverend Joan. And go PPC Leadership Council. I'm going to keep it really simple. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick-Gray, our UUA president. Thank you for answering questions that your folks wanted to hear your thoughts about. Thank you so much to Reverend Aaron, Malia, and Reverend Joan for joining me in this journey of trying to host our UUA president. Thank you so much to all the folks behind the scenes that have done the volunteering to bring it all together. We appreciate you. And we hope that you'll pay attention to the fact that you have a friend in Washington, D.C. We want to help build power for UUs here and across the country. And we invite you to join us on that journey. I'm going to hang around to ask questions, but go to the rest of your evening. Think about what you learned here tonight. Think about the 3 or 4 people that you should touch base with and remind them that you want to build power on social justice issues. Remind yourself that you are bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice, and that work requires many, many hammer strikes made in love. Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you, Reverend Susan.
My pleasure, Pablo. Thank you. Great to be with you.